My name is Anne Cooper. I'm a coffee roasting consultant, trainer and roaster based in Melbourne, Australia. Now this is the third in a series of 5 videos, and in case you missed the first 2, the first one was just an introduction of myself and my career so far, and the second one was focusing on getting to know our machine. And this is all under the umbrella topic for the series of Beyond the Cooling Tray. Pretty much, how do we set ourselves up for success? How do we know we're doing okay? How do we know that we're on track? So it's pretty much everything beyond the actual physical roasting task itself. So in this video, we're going to focus on knowing our green. Now I'm going to basically approach it more so from a production perspective. So we're going to assume that we've already bought our green coffee. We bought that coffee with a specific flavor and an intention for extraction in mind. And then I'd like to just touch on some tips and tricks I've come across in my consulting and training that help me better understand how to start roasting a coffee, and what do I do based on my experience. How do I get to know a coffee so that I know how to start roasting it? Now, we often hear in the industry a lot of roasters saying, well, I roast a Brazil this way and I roast an Ethiopian this way. Now that's because they've had the opportunity to recognize specific feedback in their roasting process, and they've gotten to know the way that it moves through certain roasting stages and how it reacts or doesn't react as well. So when we're choosing our green, we're also often faced with the tasty notes from the traders. They do tend to get very descriptive, definitely promising rainbows and unicorns and strawberries and shortcake. But at the end of the day, if we're not connected as roasters to our roasting style and our profile, then we will find it very hard to try and express and find those flavors in our green. So when I start exploring a coffee after I've purchased it, so very much I've gone through the whole assessment process, it satisfies all the checkpoints in terms of price point, availability, how much is available, how long do I want it to last for, and then where in my portfolio is it going to sit? Is it going to be roasted for espresso, or is it going to be roasted for filter? And once I've gone through that checklist, I then really need to start getting to know my green. So based on the previous video where we spoke about getting to know our machine, so we got to know the ins and outs in terms of the type of drum that it has, the type of burner, the type of controls, and then also the type of probe that will be guiding us along our way, because basically our probe is our flavor data. So now with the beans, they're now the basis of this flavor that we're wanting to express in our roasting. So I guess a nice way is a recent experience I had with a coffee, and it was a natural process coffee from Colombia. So it definitely put me into a state of very high attention, because it challenged a lot of preconceived ideas about how to roast a Colombian coffee. So more than ever, we are definitely finding in the industry, we are in an era more than ever of experimenting. So producers are no longer following traditional techniques relevant to their origin. So for example, we now have producers from Colombia doing a natural process when traditionally they were washing their coffee. And then we have countries that were traditionally focusing on natural process now dipping their toes into other forms of whether it's adding yeast, washing, and other sorts of like carbonic maceration, all those other crazy different processing techniques that are now evolving and coming onto the market. So we're definitely in an era of lots of crazy, funky flavors, and as a roaster, it's definitely then quite challenging to work out how to roast that coffee and express everything that the producer intended with their processing technique. So when getting to know a coffee, the key things I will always do is the measurements. So I will always get to know a coffee in terms of obviously its variety, the process, the screen size, and then I will start to then look at it in terms of its bound water moisture content. I don't personally own a water activity meter, but it is very handy information to have. So if you can have a trader that has done that measurement for you, so if they can measure the free water activity in that bean for you, that would be fantastic to know, just to make sure that it's not going to be going unnecessarily, either drying out too quickly, or either going, like if it's too fresh and there's too much moisture, then if you don't store it properly, then you can definitely get into some issues with that coffee. So water activity is something I rely on my trader for that information. And then of course I would do a density or a hardness test. So with those measurements in mind, that then definitely gives me an idea about how to start approaching my roasting. So back to the Colombian example. So I was quite intrigued by all of these coffees coming into the market that were not traditionally processed. So a natural process Colombian immediately piqued my attention, and I was like, I definitely want to have a go at roasting this coffee. So upon receiving the coffee, again, naturally going through the whole checklist process. So this particular Colombian was of the tabby variety. So the screen size was quite large. So I had to obviously start, keeping that in mind. Full natural process. The smell coming from the coffee was quite amazing, quite promising. And so I was, of course, quite excited to start getting to know it. The moisture content was, for me, quite normal for a Colombian coffee. It was about 11.5% of bound water moisture content. And the water activity was, I think it was just over 60 with the water activity measurement. So a little on the high side, but also quite expected considering it was fresh crop, recently delivered. So ticking all the right boxes so far for that Colombian. And then the density measurement came along. So for me, my density measurements I will either do with a 250 ml tube and follow more of the sort of bulk density protocol measurements, and having a measurement being communicated in grams per litre. I then also tend to convert it into a kilograms per hectolitre measurement as well, as I do find a lot of bits of equipment will be communicating with that value. It's also the same value that's used in the grain industry as well, so it's nice to keep some consistency with that measurement. Now, in my training and my understanding with density, we've all gotten to know that density is partly connected to the altitude at which coffee is grown. So the higher the altitude, the harder the bean and the higher the density, and the lower the altitude, the lower the density and the softer the bean it will be. So for me, traditionally, Colombian beans are always quite hard, and we'll always measure anywhere between 71 to 72 kilograms per hectolitre. So anything above 70, considering it to be hard, and then anything below 70, considering that to be soft. So I merrily do my density measurement, and I got a measurement of 66.8 kilograms per hectolitre. So literally my jaw did hit the ground in terms of, oh wow, this is really different. What am I going to do? So the first thing I did was obviously contact the trader, the person that I bought the coffee from. And that is definitely something I always recommend to roasters. If at any point you feel unsure about a coffee, don't be afraid to contact your trader, and always, instead of getting on the phone and yelling at them that there's something wrong with the coffee, just always, go through that process of seek to understand. So I always try and approach a trader if I have a potential problem and just say, look, can you please help me understand why this is different? And of course, I was just naturally questioning, holy moly, this density is really not what I expected. Were you aware of this? Is it something that I need to keep an eye on? is this what this coffee is supposed to be? So I was also naturally trying to understand, did something happen during the producers experimenting with their natural process? And is it also connected to the variety? So the tabby being quite a large bean will also potentially contribute to it naturally being a little bit lower in density as well. So these are just some things I was trying to work out, because I knew that it was high in moisture and low in density, because as a roaster, the biggest probably tip and trick I do offer to roasters based on my own experience over many, many years of roasting and working on hundreds of different machines, is that I always use the moisture content reading as a way to help me start my roast. And then I always use my density reading as a way to help guide me on what to do during first crack. Now, the reason being is because we've got to remember that water acts as a catalyst. So if we better understand the moisture content and that free bound water that's in the bean originally, then basically the ultimate goal of roasting is to heat up that water, create steam pressure so we can start to get the bean to open up and get ready for first crack. So we need to know, how much energy do I need to apply to this bean in order to start activating the amount of moisture that's bound in the structure of that coffee bean. So very much my biggest, hottest tip is moisture content in order to start the roast. So knowing what temperature to start with. And of course that will be influenced by batch size as well, and the screen size of the coffee. And then density will definitely help me understand what to do. How much energy, how much heat do I need to hold on that bean through first crack? Do I need to pull away, or do I need to keep on tickling it and pushing it through first crack so it has enough energy to be able to finish itself off for the rest of the roast? And of course I'll be using other bits of data like the rate of rise, or technically the rate of change, as a way to also help guide me and help me better understand how much heat do I need to keep on this bean. If it's a hard bean, I clearly need to hold the heat. If it's a soft bean, I clearly need to take the heat away a bit earlier. So this naturally processed Colombian coffee definitely threw me a very decent curveball, but I felt quite confident then going into roasting it because I did my measurements first. So if it's the biggest thing I can encourage you guys to do is please always explore your green first so that you know what to expect and you know how to start roasting that coffee. And of course, you can then express the flavors as intended by the producer, and you can get the best out of that coffee. And then of course it will then suit a specific intended brew method for extraction. So I can't stress that enough. In order to get the best and the flavors out of your green, really explore your measurements and your data. So thanks for listening. Our next video will be focusing on knowing our flavors. So now that we've touched a little bit on our machine and our green, we're then going to talk about how do we know how to get the best out of our flavors, and as from a production perspective, how can we best assess and understand that how have we succeeded in getting the flavors from our green.